Hello, students of the Physiological Psychology class. This is Dr. Tausman coming live to you from my house. I've got to admit, I'm a little nervous about this last module. I'm recording this the first day that the discussion boards are up, so I won't be able to integrate this right in, but there's so much to cover here. This is the last new module of information, and I'm really excited about doing it. At the same time, I'm a little nervous because there's a lot to talk about it, and I hope I can do this correctly for you. So we're going to start off with this idea of looking at mind-body things and the brain. This last unit, in a general sense, will be concerned with, in the words of physiological psychology, this link between mind and body for important things that happen cognitively. In cognitive psychology, if you know something about cognitive psychology, you know cognitive psychologists study things like learning, thinking, and memory. And so one of the first discussion board questions I put out there was, what do you think people do in the field of cognitive neuroscience? Well, in cognitive psychology, we try to study how people learn and remember things, mentally, if you will. But in the field of cognitive neuroscience, we do something a little different. We try to look at these mental functions, thinking, memory, learning, and how we process information, and see if we can find the neurobiological roots of them. So in fact, the field of cognitive neuroscience is kind of one of those mind-body fields. Remember, mind is things like thinking, feeling, perceiving, and things like memory and mental processing. So cognitive psychology is the mind part of that. The body part of that is the neuroscience. Where in the brain are things changing? What's going on in the brain? And most importantly, what I hope to show you during this particular module is that people in this field think they've actually found some things, and they may be correct, where when people learn something or memorize something, they're actually trying to figure out exactly where and what changes in the brain. So this is the idea of the mind-body link, almost reductionistic in a way, where we can take a mental process and reduce it to a physiological one. So people in the field of cognitive neuroscience study things like memory, where in the brain and how does it work. Things like language. How do we process language and what's going on in the brain? Now, we're not going to do that in this unit. Learning. How do we learn things behaviorally, and then what goes on in the brain? And even things like attention as well. So that's what the field of cognitive neuroscience is. We're going to actually start off in terms of this mind-body link, looking at the interesting topic of behaviorally the field of aggression. So your book spends a lot of time going over different types of aggression. We're not going to do that. We're going to be rather selective, and we're going to focus kind of on the same issue of cognitive neuroscience. When people are aggressive, what exactly is going on when they do these behaviors in their brain? And this field really started actually quite a long time ago. If you open your book up to page 9, you'll see the very interesting case of Phineas Gage, who was a railroad construction worker. He was a very friendly, warm individual before an accident happened. And basically what happened in the accident is a rod ended up exploding and going through the top of his head. He survived this, but his personality was totally changed. If you look at the pictures in 1.5, you can basically see that things happened after this accident, and basically what our scientists came to the conclusion of is that his limbic system was changed. So if you turn from page 9 to page 50, the discussion for this particular unit is really going to focus on, it's actually not quite page 50, let's see which, page 61. Page 61, you get a good look at the limbic system. The limbic system has become a focal point for understanding emotions in the field of cognitive neuroscience. It includes things like the amygdala, an emotion center of the brain, the hippocampus for memory, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and a lot of these other structures that seem to regulate emotion in a very, very strong way. So that's what we're going to cover in this particular unit. Let's see. So aggression and mind-body issues. Chapter 12 spends a lot of time on page 438 talking about the different types of aggression. Actually, all of chapter 12, 431 to 438. There's irritable aggression, there's territorial aggression, there's on 437 PMS aggression. We're going to focus on what we call fear-induced aggression in this particular unit. And for this unit, I'm going to really focus on a couple of different researchers and what they've actually found. The most important of these researchers is a fellow by the name of Joe Ledoux. And so I'm going to share with you, in your book, it's on page 439, but your book doesn't do a very good job of describing things, so I'm going to actually use the different textbook for this particular experiment, and I think I'm going to record this and then do the others on another recording here, is I want to go through basically the method of what was done, the results of what was done, and the meaning behind this. Most importantly, the meaning for you folks at Mary Baldwin College. So the method, very simple situation here, and it's not described very nicely in your book, but what Ledoux basically does is he sets up a study where he'll put a rat, if you will, in an operant box, a Skinner box, if you will. If you've ever seen it, if not, type in Skinner box. But it's basically a box that has a grid on it. And what he'll basically do is he'll turn on a tone for 10 seconds while the rat is in this Skinner box. And after this 10-second tone, they will deliver a brief but high-intensity shock to the floor. And when the animals get this shock, of course, the animal jumps into the air. And then when it comes down, it kind of freezes in its spot, if you will. It also has an increase in heart rate and blood pressure, which they're able to show. So on trial 1, you put a 10-second tone on, you give the shock, and the animal will have increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and a freezing response. Now, what do you think will happen behaviorally if you do this trial after trial? Hopefully, what you would figure out is that there would be an emotional response here, and the animals would become conditioned. That as soon as you turn on the tone, eventually, that the tone itself would elicit an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, as well as this freezing response, that you wouldn't need to have the foot shock. So we call this a conditioned emotional response. Does that make sense, I hope, for you folks? A conditioned emotional response, where basically as soon as you turn on the tone, something actually happens, and the animal has the increased heart rate, blood pressure, and the freezing response. So that's a simple classical conditioning paradigm. Now, the reason we're going to talk about this in the field of cognitive neuroscience is because if you're in the field of cognitive neuroscience, you'd be wanting to know the following question. What goes on inside the brain that actually allows this conditioning to work? Because normally, if I were to turn a tone on in front of an animal, the animal would do nothing. Something was learned behaviorally, so something must have changed in the brain. And that is precisely what Joe Ledoux and his team from Columbia University, you can even do a little search on it, have been actually looking at and trying to search out. And what they basically come to understand is that there is a key structure in the brain. And that key structure is the amygdala, the emotion center, if you will, of the brain, part of the limbic system. The amygdala controls fear and anger responses. And if you look at the little picture that I found in another textbook I thought was useful here, you can see that when information comes up to the amygdala, well, first, acoustic information would come up through the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is the relay station. But it seems the amygdala is the key structure in the brain that mediates things, especially the structure called the central nucleus of the amygdala. And basically what happens is when that tone comes up, what these neuroscience people have done, people like Ledoux, is they've done these studies and they've actually, number one, seen changes in how the pathways develop here. For example, if you do this kind of research, you'll actually see that there are changes between the amygdala and hypothalamus. Now, if you remember, the hypothalamus is in control of your hormones. And so they actually find that if they cut the anatomical connection between the amygdala and hypothalamus, if they cut that connection, you don't see the conditioning for the blood pressure and heart rate increase, thus suggesting that it's that connection which is being strengthened when the animals learn that the tone leads to this increase in blood pressure and heart rate. So the tone itself is coming in through the thalamus, and it's that connection between the amygdala and the hypothalamus that's causing this increased blood rate. Notice as well that there's a good connection between the amygdala and hippocampus. Remember what the hippocampus does? Well, that's the area that's responsible for memory, and so the organism remembers this through many, many trials. And finally, the freezing response they've actually found is basically predicated out of a response from the periaqueductal gray. The freezing response is the endorphins kicking in, and the animal having a freezing response, waiting for the foot shock. So what Ledoux and his team have done is basically to take a simple conditioned emotional response, go all the way up to the brain, and basically found that it was the amygdala that was responsible for this conditioning and the strengthening of the amygdala connections to the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and even the periaqueductal gray that really mattered here. So this is considered very exciting in the field of neuroscience because they are trying to figure out, when you have something change behaviorally or cognitively, what is the corresponding neuroanatomical component to that. And they have isolated the amygdala in such a way. If you read in other parts of your book or in these particular pages, you see people who have the amygdala removed seem to have less rage and less anger response. The amygdala seems to be responsible for emotional learning in this conditioned emotional response. Thank you.